أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا حبيبنا حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه مبين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي صلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل. Respected brothers and sisters, we commence with our fifth night of lectures. Now halfway through, inshallah, we should be coming to some sort of an understanding in regards to the direction that we are heading in. And following last night's discussion, we do importantly need to ask ourselves the question, what steps are there left? We've gone through certainty, we've gone through temptation, we've gone through guilt, and we've gone through the choice, as we did yesterday. So if I have now selected that which is true, and if I have now selected that which is right, and I have identified where the haqq is and have now followed in that path, surely we have 5 nights remaining with no topic of discussion. Therefore, when it comes to culminating the journey of the perfection of the soul, surely after making the right choice, I have no more further stages. I have no more further steps. I have nothing more to do. As we will come to understand today, that after an individual makes that choice, after an individual identifies what the truth is, they see that rather than their journey coming to an end, our journey actually begins. When we look at what the Jihad Akbar is and the greater Jihad is, we see that the process that we have been following so far for the past 4 nights is the process that is a muqaddamah, that is an introduction to the actual discussion of what it means to be a human. And we see that the actual journey and the actual strife and the actual discussion begins tonight. That after an individual has temptation, they feel that guilt and they make the right choice. Now what do we do? Is the journey over? Quite the contrary. We see that after an individual makes the right choice, they now have the responsibility to stay upon the right choice. Now the staying upon the haqq after the identification of it is the beginning of the journey of our life. Because we could see in our personal lives, there might be instances where we know something is right and we know something is true. And we accept it and we now begin our journey. However, how difficult is it to actually stay on that path? How difficult is it to consistently, consecutively stay upon what we believe to be true? If I believe something is true, I accept it. Now I make a choice that this thing is true. After this, how much effort is required from me to actually stay upon this path, to not get deluded, to not get distracted, to not move anywhere else? So the theme of our discussion today, inshallah, will be upon steadfastness. That after we have identified what the truth is, after we have identified what falsehood is, after we have made the truth to go towards the haqq and to refrain from the batil, now we have the incredibly difficult part of the journey, which is to actually stay on the path of the haqq that we chose. Is to actually stay steadfast upon the options that we have selected. And as I mentioned, this becomes apparent in examples in our everyday life. If you go to university, or if you choose a particular job, you would see that you identified this job to be the correct option for you. So you chose the right option. Our discussion for yesterday, choosing the correct option. However, staying in this job, or staying in this course at university, staying in this relationship, does this not require far more work than just initially selecting it to be true? Than just initially selecting it to be the path where I want to head? Therefore, when we look at our 2 parallel journeys, that of the journey of the soul and that of the journey of Imam Abdullah al-Hussein, we see that what we are trying to put across is that what the Battle of Karbala is that it's a microcosm of the journey and the battle within inside our own soul. Our soul has 2 dimensions, does it not? It has a part that calls us to good and it has a part that calls us to evil. We have a nafs al-ammar within inside us that brings us to temptation. And we have a ruh within inside us that takes us towards heaven. We see every single microsecond of our life is governed by this ability. I have the choice to do right, or I have the choice to do wrong. So understanding this notion, we see that Karbala is simply a very clear macrocosm of what this is. There's one side upon the truth, and there's one side upon falsehood. The same way within my soul. There is one side upon the truth, and there is one side upon falsehood. Therefore, the purpose of my life now becomes what? The destruction of this falsehood. The destruction of the ego. The destruction of the nafs al-ammara, and the destruction of my base and carnal desires, so that I can actually let haqq triumph. So as I mentioned, the mirror reflection of the war between the soul and the war between Imam Hussein and Yazid is what we need to bear in mind here. And an important point to notice, inshallah, before we begin our discussion on steadfastness, is we need to make sure that this parallel is always brought to mind. Now, when we talk about an individual such as Yazid, we see that any amount of contempt that we have for this individual would not be enough. Any amount of distaste one would have for this individual would not be enough. And you would see us as individuals, where we see where the truth lies, we have this utter distaste for an individual of the likes of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. So when we look at this individual and we have this contempt, and we have this disgust, and we have this distaste, I ask you, brothers and sisters, our ultimate enemy and our biggest enemy, I ask you, is it Yazid? Or in the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, is it our own nafs? I ask you, ultimately, our biggest enemy, our biggest opposition, is it something externally? Or is it that battle that we fight internally? So the same way we have this disgust, this contempt, this distaste towards an individual such as Yazid ibn Muawiyah, which is well earned and I would say underdone even. Do we have the same approach when we look at the illnesses in our own soul? Do we have the same approach when we look at that element of Yazid within inside us that calls us to sin, that calls us to greed, that calls us to lust, that calls us to desire? So when we talk about this, we see we must be consistent in our approach, where we say that just because it's manifested in human form doesn't mean it is any less vicious than that enemy within inside me, which in the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, is greater, is far greater than any enemy that we would be able to tackle on the outside, the nafs within. Therefore, we start our discussion on what we actually need to do on this stage of the journey. We spoke about the certainty that the soul possessed at the beginning. Each and every one of us, we began our journey with certainty. Then after that, we descended onto the world that we are currently in, and then there is the existence of temptation, which could pull us from the certainty that we initially possessed. After that, we see that we have now a dichotomy in our heart. And this is, of course, the emotion of guilt. Guilt now tells us that there is a higher truth that my soul is yearning towards. And this guilt is now pushing me towards making a decision. In our last night's discussion, we said that this guilt must now push me to make a decision, and now I must make a choice. I make the right choice, or I make the wrong one. And yesterday, through the analogy we mentioned of the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, we saw that it is in the right choice of Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi. It is in the right choice of us in our day-to-day basis that we are actually able to begin our pursuit to the truth itself. Therefore, after that choice, as I mentioned, our journey actually begins. And we see that now I have established what my path is. Now I have established what the truth is. I need to now make sure that I stay steadfast upon this path. And it's much more easier said than done, is it not? Staying steadfast upon the truth and staying steadfast upon the haqq. That an individual, it would be difficult for them to stay steadfast if fear comes into the equation, if desire comes into the equation. You have now made a decision, and that decision is positive. It's upon the haqq. However, if a difficulty now befalls you, are we going to stay upon the path? If a calamity now falls upon you, do we stay upon the path? When an individual, for example, starts questioning their religion, when a calamity falls upon them, you may be familiar with someone like this, and it may also be yourself. You see that when difficult things are happening in our lives, sometimes an individual might question religion and they might question the existence of God. We see that now is the importance of the role of steadfastness. And now is the importance of the role of istiqamah. Therefore, when we look at the Arabic word that we would appropriate to steadfastness, I would say in the Holy Quran, the word istiqamah is brought. And the word istiqamah is something that we can actually learn from in regards to its semantic derivation and its practical implementations. So when we look at the trilateral root of istiqamah, we see that there are many derivations that come out of this. However, we can see istiqamah comes from the root that means strong, it comes from the root that means noble, and it comes from the root that means guided. And of the many derivations that we see of istiqamah in the Holy Quran is one particular word that we read on a daily basis. In Surah Fatiha, when we state, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, is this mustaqim not a derivation of the istiqamah that we are speaking about? So when we look at mustaqim, and when we look at its derivations, we see this mustaqim means guided. This mustaqim means straight. This mustaqim means the path, and this mustaqim means my purpose. So therefore, if I understand that in order for me to be steadfast, I must make sure that I consolidate myself upon the path and upon the truth, the answer to my question now starts to become a bit more apparent. So our journey would continue in this notion when we look at the definition and the difficulties of steadfastness and how an individual can actually implement this in our life. It's easier said than done for me to sit here and say that we must be steadfast upon our decisions and we move on from there. But again, practically speaking, we ask ourselves the question, how? How does an individual stay steadfast upon the right decision they've made? How does an individual stay steadfast upon the correct path that they have chosen? It's incredibly noble. You have selected the right path. However, as I said, the journey has not even begun. And then we start questioning ourselves. I start questioning on myself. What low-level consciousness am I operating on where simply beginning the journey for me has become the journey itself? Where simply just selecting the right option for me is the entirety of the journey. However, as we see in the story of Karbala, it's not simply selecting or choosing the right option, but rather choosing the right option and staying steadfast upon your decision, whether you approach death or death approaches you. So on that note, we see in chapter 29, verse 2 of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the individual who believes, do they think that they will not be tested? And it's a beautiful verse. Those of you who say, I believe, do you think that's where the test ends for you? Those of you who say, I believe, is that now going to be the end of our journey? Rather, we see the Holy Quran is telling us, you have now chosen your direction, now our challenge will begin. You have chosen your direction, now let our journey start. So we have chosen our direction and we have stated that we believe. We have stated where the haqq is. We have stated we are with Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. However, as I mentioned, simply stating a fact or simply stating a truth does not make us a participant of it. If I state that I am a follower of Imam Ali alayhi salam, does this have any value if I do not act like Imam Ali did? If I say I'm a Shia of Ali ibn Abi Talib, however, I do not act as if Imam Ali would have, I ask you, does this have any meaning? Does this have any definition? As we mentioned, that certainty is only certainty when tested. And we can see that the test only happens through action and implementation. So when I have a belief and I have chosen what is true, after that when I am tested and I go through and stay steadfast on my journey, only then can I truly say that I am a Shia of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And we have traditions from the Ma'sumin where they say, be very careful. Call yourselves lovers of the Ahlul Bayt. However, being a Shia of the Ahlul Bayt is a very big description. And this description comes with responsibility. And this responsibility means steadfastness. Not simply acknowledging the wilayah, not simply acknowledging their truth, but rather living upon that path and living upon what we understand. So looking at that verse of the Holy Quran, we see that our journey truly begins after we decide what is true. And our journey only begins after we say what is in the haqq. So understanding that point, we now take our journey to a prophetic one. And here we can see that it was after the Anbiya, confessed their commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that their trials truly began. If we look at Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, after he testified and declared the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was thrown in the fire. Was he not? When we look at Nabi Musa alayhi salam, after his prophethood was announced, then he had to challenge Fir'aun in his court, and he fought and he saw the exile of his people. When we look at the Holy Prophet himself, after he testified and became prophet, we see the trials and the tribulations that came in the life of this particular Nabi. So we see that after the commitment, we see the trials coming through. And after the commitment, we see where the haqq is. And if we see that this is happening in the life of the Prophet, then I ask you, is this not going to happen in ours? If this is happening in the life of the Anbiya, I ask you, is this not going to happen in the life of a mere mortal? So that being said, we see that steadfastness is the next part of the journey of the soul. That after we have identified the haqq, staying upon it is what we must do. And staying upon it is what we must seek. And someone may ask the question, why? What's the purpose behind all of this? I have chosen the haqq and I have identified it. Surely that should be the culmination of my journey. And surely everything should end there. Why is it the case that I am tested further? Why is it the case that I am in pain further? Why is it the case that I have to grieve further when I have already identified what the truth is? And I have already identified what direction I need to head in. We see the answer to this is very straightforward. And the answer to this is very simple. When an individual asks, why is it that my test begins after I direct myself towards the truth? We use the analogy of gold. When we look at gold, we see that in order to purify gold, what do? We burn it, right? You apply heat to it. When you apply heat to gold, it refines, does it not? It becomes more pure. The extra waste elements of gold now go away, and the purity of it remains. In order for me to purify it more, I must apply more heat. In order for me to get it closer to its original form, I must apply more intensity. I must apply more harara, as we mentioned in our lecture yesterday, which was the root of our discussion. So we see that in order for gold to be purified to its final form, and we understand this quite logically, I ask you, is the soul any different? The purpose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala putting trials and tribulations in our way and testing our steadfastness after we have established the truth is not to break us, is not to push the soul in another direction, is not to make us disillusioned or disenfranchised, but rather He is trying to make sure that every element of wastage on us that is not connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sheds before we actually make our union with Him. The same way we look at gold and we see that every element that is not gold is going to be shed before it gets to its final purified form. We see the journey of the soul, it's put through fire and intensity and pressure, so that every element of it that is yearning for the dunya, every element of it that is yearning for multiplicity, every element of it that's yearning for materialism is burnt off until we get the final pure form of the ruh, of the soul, unadulterated by the ego, that's answered Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's primary call of Alastu bi Rabbikum, and of course goes back to our initial response, the response of Bala, Shahidna. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now the second part of the parallel journey, steadfastness. We are on the stage of the soul. We are on the fifth part of our journey, which shows that we must now, after selecting the truth, move in a steadfast manner. Now, after selecting the truth, must stay upon it. So which example and analogy can we bring in to really drive this point home? When we look at a character, the likes of Muslim ibn Awsija, we see that he does not have an elaborate backstory. For example, like Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi, an individual who was in charge of battalions. Then after that, we see this incredible dramatic change where he chose the haqq. We see that the beauty in Muslim ibn Awsija is not so much in the dramatic backstory, but more so in his sustained and his continued steadfastness upon the journey. Where we see that Muslim himself, he was an individual who was not young at the point of Karbala. Some reports state that he was 70 years old. So we can see that almost every single point of his journey, similar to the others, would have been faced by difficulty, and it may have been magnified due to the position that he was in. However, when the difficulty faced him, he did not allow this to be a reason for him to turn away. When the difficulties came to him, he did not allow this to be a reason to turn away from the truth. When a heaviness fell upon him, he did not allow his steadfastness to break. Actually, it consolidated him upon this journey. Again, when we look at the likes of Muslim ibn Awsija, we see that Muslim himself, he was an individual who was well known for his taqwa, and an individual well known for his character. And he was also, in his day, known as a valiant soldier and an individual with incredible bravery. And when we saw that he chose the path of Imam Hussein, he made that choice, he selected the haqq. He was very adamant to stay steadfast upon it. He did not fall victim, as we mentioned, like the Shia of Kufa. He did not fall victim like the other people who left Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. He did not fall victim to those who didn't even select Abu Abdullah al-Hussein in the first place. Rather, he had the tawfiq to accept him, and then he had the tawfiq to stay upon his path. We see that Muslim ibn Awsija was an individual who was with Muslim ibn Aqil when they were betrayed by the Shia of Kufa. However, did he allow this to dispel him from his journey? Did he allow this to make him become disenfranchised from what the truth was? By no means. We see after this, he went directly back to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein in Karbala, and he continued his journey from there. So when we look at ourselves, when we look at our journey, we see that even after we know what's right, we have selected what's right, are we staying upon what's right? When we look at the example of Muslim ibn Awsija, you see choosing Imam Hussein was easy. And again, we're using very relative terms. How difficult was it to choose Imam Hussein? Choosing Imam Hussein was easy. Staying with Imam Hussein was where the journey was. Staying with Imam Hussein was where the soul actually began to purify. Staying with Imam Hussein was actually where the soul began to perfect itself. So when we see this, we look at the story of Muslim ibn Awsija, and we are given lesson upon lesson of what steadfastness looks like, and how me as an individual on my day-to-day, I can actually act upon this. Whether it's me in my studies, I must stay steadfast. Me on my career, I must stay steadfast. Me in my relationship with my spouse, I must stay steadfast. We see this is an essential and critical part of the human journey that has to be acted out in all facets and all destinations. So when we look at the example of this esteemed individual, we see that, as I mentioned, he was in Kufa. And still, despite that, he didn't allow this to set him back. And he went to Imam Hussein. So the story is long. However, the historical account suggests that when Imam Hussein, at that critical point, gave everybody permission that you may now leave, you have no responsibility over me. What was the response of Muslim ibn Awsija? What was the famous speech that he mentioned here? He said, on the day of judgment, when I am facing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can I tell him that I have fulfilled my right over you? He said, Ya Aba Abdullah, I will pierce their chests with my sword. If I have no weapons, I will throw stones at them. I will continue my offense up until the point of my death. And I have made my decision at this case. And we see up until the very point of his death, we see that a lot of us, when it comes to decision making, we may get cold feet, right? Even after we do something good. After we do something good, and then, for example, there's some backlash or some consequences, we now start to get cold feet. We now start to say, was it even worth it? I'm not even doing it for myself. There's no actual benefit to me at all. What's the point of me doing this? We see Muslim ibn Awsija up until the very end, there was no question mark in his mind. When he passed away, the only things and the last words that he said were to his friend Habib. And his only sentiment at this point in time was, my request to you, O my friend, is not to leave the side of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Istiqamah, steadfastness. When he went to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, Imam Hussein stated to him, O Muslim, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon your soul. And then he mentioned some lines. He said, among them are those who have fulfilled their vow of death. Among them are those who waited for their turn. And among them are those who have not altered in their commitment. What lines by Imam Hussein. And what an honor for Muslim ibn Awsija, where he is said about him that he did not falter in his commitment to what he believed to be true. He did not err by any means after he made his decision upon what the haqq was. That certainty that he had within inside him, he re-established his connection with it. Therefore, everything else became secondary and his relationship with the truth became primary. Therefore, when we look at this, there's nothing but admiration for an individual like Muslim ibn Awsija. Well, we see that he was not just an individual who had the tawfiq to make the right decision, but he was an individual who had the tawfiq to remain steadfast. Therefore, when we look at our lives and we look at our journeys, we see that making the right decision is important, but it's the first step of the journey. We see that staying upon that path, even though it may get difficult, even though there may be pain and even though there may be torment, the same way that gold needs to be put under fire to be refined, our souls need to be put under pressure in order to shed the veils of the ego that we have around us. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we bring our discussion to a close, we see in the story of Muslim ibn Awsija that this istiqamah is an application that we can actually have in our everyday life. And this istiqamah is not just a necessary part of the soul's journey, but istiqamah is a necessary part of our day-to-day life. And we can theorize in regards to what is the best approach to do this. However, again, now we must come to the practical segment of our lecture. What can I actually do in order to get steadfast? What can I actually do in order to have this istiqamah? What can I actually do after I've made the incredibly difficult decision of what is true, of then making the even more difficult decision on staying on what is true? We see that the first answer to this question is re-establishing our why. Why is it that we did this in the first place? Why is it that we are doing this? Again, whether it may be a degree at university, whether it may be your job or career, you go back to your initial reasons why. You may become disillusioned, you may become distracted. In the middle of your journey, you say, I no longer want to do this anymore. What keeps you going? The initial why. What am I doing this for? When we reestablish and take ourselves to the initial why, when we reestablish and take ourselves to what we are actually doing, we can see that our mission now has a purpose to it. When we look at Muslim ibn Awsija, he took himself back to the initial why. Why am I doing this? Because Imam Hussein is with the truth. Therefore, no matter what came to him, his dedication to the truth was higher. So therefore, we see that our why needs to be sincere and our why needs to be of value. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, make sure your niyyah of everything is qurbatan illallah. Because if I am doing something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then I take myself back to the initial why, there is going to be nothing more superior than it. If I do something, for example, for the sake of being wealthy, and now difficulties are befalling me. If difficulties are befalling me, I'll say it's not even worth it. Longevity and sustainability to get closer to him. So the second point in answer to our question, how can I develop this istiqamah? How can I develop this path, this sirat al-mustaqim, this steadfastness in order for me to be successful in my journeys? We see that the second point is that steadfastness requires structure. Structure. We need process. In order for an individual to be successful and steadfast in their journey, they require a process to fall on. And you can read any habits book that we currently have in the market, whether it's Atomic Habits by James Clear, whether it's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Whoever you may read, you would see that it's the structure. We fall to what our process is rather than what our motivation is. And when, for example, we look at practical examples, I would say that if we look at a system that if an individual is an alcoholic, alhamdulillah, as Muslims, we don't have to deal with this. However, the process is an interesting one. There's a group called Alcoholics Anonymous. And this group is incredibly statistically successful. 50% of people leave it entirely, and then another 25% relapse and then leave it entirely. So we see this process is something that is incredibly useful. Why? There's a 12-stage process, and alongside this 12-stage process, we see that there is accountability. And alongside accountability, they have this one special statement. And this is something that we can definitely use, and this is something that we can definitely apply. They don't say that I want to be sober for a lifetime. They don't say that I want to get rid of this for life. They simply say one day at a time. Therefore, when we look at our spirituality, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to estimate a lifetime. However, instead of me saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants me to be perfect now and forever, instead if I clearly dictate my life by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just wants me to be sincere today, watch the difference in your life and see what happens from there. The issue with us is that we become overwhelmed by quantity, by saying that the journey is too long, the journey is too far, the journey is too overwhelming, let me get rid of it entirely, the illusionment of choice. However, if I just focus myself to today, that's my responsibility is just to be sincere today, then we can see one day at a time, we will purify our soul. And one day at a time, we will purify our nafs. The third and the final answer to our question, how can I attain istiqamah? How can I become like Muslim ibn Awsija? How can I complete this particular stage of the soul? Is we need to find a spiritual mentor. And this is potentially the most important point that I can make today. That when we look at direction, it's baffling for me that an individual who is serious about their spiritual journey, they have not sought a spiritual mentor. They have not sought an individual to take direction from. When we are living in a place like the United Kingdom, we see that, alhamdulillah, especially for the standards of the West, we are in no lack of individuals that we can go and seek advice and knowledge from. So therefore, when it comes to accountability, we see that an individual stays steadfast. Why? Again, going back to the 12-stage process. One of their segments are accountability. When, for example, you go to the gym with someone, you're more accountable, are you not? When, for example, you go to work and all of your colleagues are there, you're going to have more istiqamah. You're going to be more steadfast, are you not? So therefore, in our spiritual journey, why would it be any different? Why would this be any different when we want to attain proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So the seeking of a spiritual mentor is incredibly important, and this needs to be right at the top of an individual's list if they are serious about the pursuit of perfection. And we can see this as common practice in the Hawza Ilmiya. When we look at Qum, an integral part of our dars is what? Dars akhlaq, right? And in dars akhlaq, you are given specific instruction. Do this amal and don't do that. You say that, listen, I'm struggling with this particular thing today. They say, okay, make sure you avoid it, X, Y, and Z. There is a weekly session, there is a follow-up, there is a conversation where you go and you speak to them. You have a spiritual mentor and a direction that you can actually take. And we can see that there is prophetic example to this. I ask you, are all incredibly abundantly familiar with the story of Musa and Khizr, are you not? Did he not need a spiritual mentor? Did he not need some guidance? Did he not need some support in his journey in order to stay steadfast and in order to have that istiqamah? So to someone at the maqam of a Nabi, we can see that most definitely we would require one too. So seeing that, we see that a spiritual mentor is someone that we require in order to keep us steadfast. And when we again go back to the example of the Hawza, these individuals give us specific prescriptions in regard to what it is that we need to do. And you follow up with them. The same way accountability partner at gym or at work or wherever it may be, you see when it comes to spirituality, is it going to be any different? Quite the contrary, is it infinitely more important for you to have guidance now in the matters of spirituality? Instead of just going to the shaykh or going to the Syed and asking a shari'i question and that's the extent of your relationship with them, pester them, hinder them. We have a hadith saying that you must annoy the ulama to this extent with your questions and with what you are asking them. Therefore, when it comes to your spiritual mentorship, we must take full accountability of this. And we can see even when it comes to the Anbiya, they are required of this. And therefore, when it comes to us, we must make sure that we hold ourselves to this metric too. Find someone, ask them, speak to them about your problems and navigate yourself so that you can stay upon this truth of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. We conclude upon istiqamah, where we state that practically speaking, we have been given some advice in regards to what we actually need to do. Go back to our original yes. Find a spiritual mentor. Make sure that we have developed a process. And this aspect of a process is given to us. Is given to us by the greatest of all creation, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Where he said something very interesting. He mentioned that an individual, whoever he may be, dedicates themselves to devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for 40 days. You've heard of this tradition. An individual who dedicates themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for 40 days, he states that the truth will be pouring out of his heart and into his tongue. So we can see that we must now establish a 40-day rule for ourselves. We see that we must establish a 40-day proof for ourselves. Again, coming back to processes and habit building, we can see that the academic literature suggests the same. When we look at the UCR research, they say anything from 18 to 254 days would be what we need to develop a habit. However, they stopped at their best estimate of 66 days. Let's follow what the Holy Prophet said. He stated 40 days. Simply dedicate 40 days. If you want to add something to your life, commit to 40 days. If you want to take something away from your life, commit to 40 days. We want to add this process in our life so that we can develop this istiqamah, we can develop this steadfastness, so that we stay upon the path of the truth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that when the time may come to make the correct decision, for us is incredibly convenient and incredibly easy, because we have already developed that istiqamah within inside us. So for us, what we must do is follow these steps on steadfastness, follow these steps on istiqamah, follow these lessons of Muslim ibn Awsija, and understand where our journey is headed. That, as I mentioned, as difficult as it was, the choosing of Imam Hussein was easy for Muslim ibn Awsija. The difficulty was staying on the path. Therefore, for us, choosing the path of Islam, choosing the path of Tashayyu', choosing the path of Amir al-Mu'mineen, choosing the path of the Ma'asumeen themselves, as difficult as it may be, with all of the extra noise that is currently occurring, with all of the differing ideologies, with all of the confusion and propaganda, this is only the first step of the journey. Staying upon this is where the entirety of the decision lies. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inshallah grant us tawfiq to continue in His way. Wa akhir da'wana walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.